Blessings, everyone. Thank you for joining me. It's a real honor today to get to speak with Archpriest George Aquaro. Is that right? Okay. Okay. And this is a treat too, because Father George is here in California with me. So Father is down
Not
in.
anymore. I'm not in California. I'm in freedom. I'm in Idaho.
I thought you were in LA.
No, no, I got out of there in 2017.
Okay, sorry. But you spent most of your life here. So
Yeah, wandering about, it was one of those places that seemed, I'd always drift back towards.
I read your bio here at the end of your were you born in LA? Were you born there?
Yeah, I was born in San Fernando Valley.
Okay. Okay. And then you were at a couple of different parishes there, and you went to St. Vladimir's in New
Hmm.
York. Okay. Now, are you a convert, Father?
Yes.
Okay. What religion, if any, were you raised in or born in?
I was kind of I jokingly refer to it as I was raised pagan.
Oh,
I mean, there was a lot of kind of occult stuff going on in my family as a kid. Was we had a kind of an unofficial semi connection with Christianity. Like, I mean, we did Christmas and Easter, but it was strictly kind of pro forma. I mean, you had to have the Christmas tree, you have to have the gifts, but the whole going to church. The only time I ever went to church as a kid was in the 70s when my grandmother, when she was babysitting me, she'd take me to mass,
hmm.
and I just remember standing and not understanding anything that was going on. uh
That was a Catholic church.
yes, yeah, she was Italian Catholic.
Okay. Were you baptized, Father, as a child, as a baby?
Yeah, my parents actually had me baptized in the Episcopal church, because in their time in the 60s, you didn't not baptize your kids, and so I think they went with the one with the easiest rules to get a kid baptized. And yeah, then by like the 1970s rolled around, my sister was born. Um she wasn't baptized. She went through something else. So yeah.
Now, how did you, I know, make a long story short, how did you get interested in Orthodoxy?
Well, so let me see, going through um life, kind of without any kind of guidance, and probably doing a lot of stuff that's, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but um eventually what happened was, I became convinced that I had a serious problem I needed to deal with. This was in I was about 22, and so I that began kind of my search for God. And in doing so, I became acquainted with what I guess what you call, 12-step program, and went that route, and that got me looking for God. And then I was disappointed because I wasn't finding God anywhere. A lot of people talking about him, but and I probably knew about God's enemies much more than I knew about him. So, long story short, I ended up in the United States Navy and stationed in Greece.
Oh,
And I tell people my story about my very first Pascha, which I was introduced to it by the our chief, who was handing out news assignments. I was working as a reporter on this little teeny radio television service on base, and I was told, okay, you need to go out and film the Judas burnings. And I said, what's a Judas burning? And they said, oh, that's how the Greeks do Easter here. And sure enough, like all over this island, they burn effigies of Judas during the rush procession at midnight. I discovered the priests really don't like it, but they also can't fight, 1,000 years of tradition. So but I had a lot of questions about Orthodoxy as a result of being there and kind of wondering what it was all about. And so I came back to the United States and actually went to a Protestant school, and I wanted to get a history degree to study Christianity and find out what the history was, because I was very convinced I had no idea what it was. And that led me to taking my very first class at the school was with an Orthodox priest who was teaching Greek. And I said, you got to tell me about this stuff, because all I've seen is them, ancient churches and people burning things. And he says, well, let me help you out. And he gave me some books, and I read it. I was, oh my goodness, this stuff this is the only thing I've ever seen that kind of lines up with the 12 steps, everything else. It was everything that was like page 12 of the big book. I'm like, they were pointing towards something, and there it is. And so that convinced me to convert. And then that led me to get into later on is as a priest is having people coming to me with addictions issues, and then end up getting invitations and traveling and talking, trying to help Orthodox countries where you have the faith, but you have a problem with sobriety, and how do you line up the 12 steps with the Orthodox faith. And so I felt like I was kind of doing a translation thing. And then that led me, obviously, when you talk about addictions, to get into the topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is about sex. And because there's, not that there isn't a problem with sexual addictions these days, who'd have thought? But
No.
yeah, so that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you, Father. The Father is referring to his work on addictions, and that's sort of how, kind of a roundabout, interesting way you always meet people on the internet. So on Patristic Faith website, which is, gosh, I've met some awesome priests and religious. So through that website, Father Deacon Ananias
Yes.
Storm and Father Turbo Qualls and Father Hans. Um, what's Father Hans's last name? Father Hans
Jacobsi?
Jacobsi. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've met all of these. Well, and now you, Father George, I've met through this website, so I can't recommend it enough. It's very approachable. There's a wide range of material on there for beginners and advanced people. I would say I'm beginner to intermediate. So, and I find a lot of things there that I can read or watch or listen to. And there was an article by Father there called I gotta move things further away. Church, let's see. Oh, sexual appetite in historical Christianity. It's long, but I think it's readable because I have some background in some of the historical stuff you're talking about, but not, I would say, a ton. And I could read it and get something out of it. I think everybody will find um, anything, they'll find something that they can relate to. I liked how, so the article's kind of structured, but I want people to read it. I don't want to go through the whole thing, sentence by sentence. But the whole thing is structured on sort of the historical uh, timeline of sort of what would you say, Father, sexual history, or I mean, you start with the Near East, the ancient Near East, and then you go to the Jews, and then you go to the ancient Greeks, and then you keep going. And I like that because my degree is in history, so I liked how you laid it out, and I could follow it. The one thing I used my highlighter pen, so and I can't read things online when I'm reading things like
Yeah.
um, well, I shouldn't say seriously, but when I'm really trying to read things in depth, I can't read it online. I got to print it out. So um, I liked how, and this article isn't about homosexuality in particular, but you do mention it a lot. And what I liked in the beginning too was that you said that the Greeks and the Romans weren't homosexual or didn't foster a sort of gay culture like we have today. And I thought that's good. And you kind of described why, because I used to be involved in that LGBT space. And
Mhm.
oftentimes you hear that, well, the ancient Greeks and Romans were gay. So it's like it's nothing new,
Mhm.
which is true. But they weren't gay in the sense that we think of today as
Mhm.
as an identity. Did they partake in homosexual activity? Yeah. But were people identifying as gay back then? No. So,
Yeah,
that,
it's it's a completely different um way of thinking about things. And that was what I found I guess surprising, because I think that the psychological model that we have today has become so dominant, we don't know how to not think of it that way. And remember, the word, I keep going back to the word homosexual didn't exist until the mid 18th century, and it coincides with the advent of psychology, and they were trying to diagnose something. It was a diagnostic tool for this new system, where all human experience is kind of boiled down to kind of a thought process. And they're trying to, what is this thought process, and they call it homosexuality. But prior to that, there were I think what we consider now the definition of homosexual as somebody who has a certain type of sexual proclivity for somebody of the same.
Mhm.
Nowadays, I mean, the language changes. Are we talking about sex or gender? Or, let's stir the pot a little bit and make things more confusing. Um, but there wasn't a notion of them being separate.
Mhm.
There wasn't a separate type of sexuality. This is your sexuality. This is your sexuality. And this is where you see, I think, the kind of the atomization going on now of identities and things like that. And it's because it's where when you break down the cohesion of the human person, um, and you get rid of those the things that bind us all together, our commonalities, everything just all comes apart and just gets, first it breaks into big chunks, and those big chunks get into smaller chunks, and it goes in all different directions.
I like in this article too that you reference art, and you did in the beginning with like well, those are a prehistoric example. Like people will recognize the Venus of Willendorf probably because I mean since um, before the advent of civilization, um, sex was always, and you say right here, sex was linked to reproduction. So
Hmm.
that's how most people thought of it, not so much equating sex and identity, but sex was to reproduce.
Yeah, well, the Greeks had like the Greeks had two baskets. It was either they had like what they called natural sex, which is husband wife, and they make babies, and they need to make babies. There wasn't a question like, we're getting married, but should we have like two kids or three? No, you wanted to have like as many as possible. Why? Because, well, occasionally one gets run over by an ox cart, the other one catches some terrible disease, and that was your 401k. So there was the kind of that normal sex, and then there was these varying degrees afterwards of the fun stuff.
Yep.
And for the particularly with the Greeks, they got very heavily into. And if you the book that I cite the most on this, that I think everybody who's interested in the topic should have all of her works, is Professor Eva Cantarella, and she talks about the Greek approach to sexuality and what was going on there. But the everything goes attitude that we have nowadays, for the Greeks, that would have been abhorrent. For, let's say, for example, a man to be in the stay away from the colorful language, in the passive position, let's say, for that to happen, you'd lose your citizenship. It was because you were taking the place of a woman, and this because they had the Greek notion of sexuality, I guess, is, if you want to look at it, was that you had a sexual appetite. You have a desire or this, and you were supposed to control that to the extent that you were governing it to stay within kind of the lines that society had. So, you were supposed to be with your wife. You could potentially go to a prostitute, but you definitely couldn't be in the passive position. And it was even really looked down upon, even if you were in, let's say, the active position. If you were a man with another man who is in his fullness of his manhood, that was still kind of like, why are you doing that? And so, but I think that the division that we have, the homosexuality as we know it now, is kind of a combination of two things: the man bedding side, let's say, the same sex contact side, and then this other side, which is softness, malakos, and to be kind of effeminate, to be soft. And they're combined in the two, but in the classical sense, they were always kind of separate. It was shameful to be a soft man, whether or not, without your sex, your choice of sexual activities, to be soft was bad. You were effeminate, you were mushy, it was considered to be it was horrible. Why? Because you can't defend, there's barbarians that are out there, and a soft man can't pick up a sword and shield and go out and drive off those barbarians. And this comes about again and again, even into the Christian period, like Emperor Theodosius, when he shuts down the gay, let's say gay, the male brothels in Constantinople. He talks about we're losing our manhood, or really, how are we going to defend the empire when our men are becoming soft? And then the notion on the other side of male same-sex contact, there was a notion that, well, men don't necessarily have to be soft in order for that to happen. You think about, well, what goes on in prisons, right? There's male contact that goes on in prisons where you guys are not, it's like, I'm not gay. He's a tough dude. He's covered in tattoos, but he will have a sexual liaison with another prisoner because he's, well, I'm locked up. And I think we kind of acknowledge that the category of homosexuality is kind of insufficient. We just don't want to look at it too closely.
Yeah, you hit all the points there that I wanted to go through, Father. In that, thank you. The first, this is you made this point early on in your essay, and I liked it because I think it kind of goes to where we're at right now, and you're relating to this, I think, to all the confusion that people have about the history of homosexuality, what the Bible actually says, and all these other things, all the confusion people have. You said, with all of this has come confusion and dissent, as we now see open conflict between homosexuals and transsexuals over the nature and permanence of gender and sexual identity. I thought, wow, that's really good. I wanted to show you, Father, if I could share my screen. Let's see, share. Can you see that, Father?
Yes.
All right. So that says, this is from this confirms what Father said in that first page, really, first few paragraphs. So this is from a group called Gays Against Groomers. So supposedly these are gay people that don't subscribe to I don't know what they're doing. They sort of transgenderism has been equated with grooming,
Hmm.
and they say they're against that. Well, gays have been grooming forever, but they're saying, don't trans our gay youth, a gender non-conforming youth overwhelming to grow up to be gay and lesbian adults. Stop transing the gay away.
Hmm.
And here's another one, transing gay youth. No child is born in the wrong body, but they also claim that children are born gay. So I think father is going right to that sort of civil war that's taking place, even within these. Well, I don't know if they were never harmonious, but these gay LGBTQIA groups, that are out
Well,
there.
it taps into, I think that um, very recently a movie came out, and it was Matt Walsh, What is a Woman?
Yeah.
And so Matt Walsh asked this question, what is a woman? And everybody goes, that's the whole premise of the movie, is he interviews experts and they all kind of can't really give a satisfactory answer. And I think you could do the same thing and ask the question, what is sex?
Yeah. Yeah.
And not even what is gender. Let's not go there. Let's just ask, what is sex? Now, if you take the uh this modern thing, is it trans, is it homosexuality, you're trying to figure, but we don't even know what it is. We don't, if you're saying, well, somebody is homosexual, what makes them that way? um and Invariably the modern thought is you go back to thinking, and there must be some kind of a thought process, and da 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 da. And so, and that was why, there was the idea, we'll have conversion therapy. And I think we all can agree that, in most cases, conversion therapy, where you're going to somehow talk through issues, is going to change your, let's say, quote unquote, sexual orientation. Doesn't work.
I want to talk more
Um,
about that with you, Father.
and what's that?
I want to talk more about that with you, Father,
Okay.
a little later.
Okay. Well, but what's, obviously we're seeing the feeding frenzy now. It's the movement, all these various movements now are starting to turn on one another because they don't have a coherent understanding of what sexuality even is. And so, um, they don't know, and they have their kind of mini ideas and all that, but they're eventually going to come into conflict with one another because, what you see there is, I think that it seems like what I'm reading is that the gay movement is seeing the trans movement as an extermination of their next generation, because their next generation qualifies as, and they realize that they're not going to be them. If they're looking at themselves as a movement, and most movements end up becoming instruments of self-actualization, survival, bureaucracies and institutions eventually become just about the survival of the institution, right? Well, their institution's gone away. I mean, they had their flag, and they had all their stuff and this and that, and now the pipeline of people coming into it is being cut off, literally. That was an unintentional pun.
Mm,
um
this is a pretty
but
good one.
but
And
it's tragic. It's absolutely, it's horrendous for everyone concerned.
no. The other point you made in the introduction section is about, and you mentioned this, is about how in Greek society a man would lose his status if he was a passive partner
Hmm.
in homosexual relations, and there's this dichotomy in that between. I think the classic example is like Emperor Hadrian and his lover Antinous.
Hmm.
And Emperor Hadrian was always represented as quite a masculine character with a beard, and Antinous is sort of an ephebe. You see him and statues all over, because when Antinous had died, Hadrian just sort of flashed these statues all over the Roman world. And and this dichotomy, gay people can disagree with me all they want, but this dichotomy between masculine and, let's say, not as masculine exists, I think, still in gay male culture. So
Mhm.
so you see it here in its, if you want to think of its foundations in the ancient Near East, as you say here, and in the later world, I guess you could say. And then you can we switch now? I want to switch to Judaism real quick.
Okay, sure.
Talk about this is interesting. You wrote, in terms of Judaism, a man's seed does not belong to himself exclusively, but are, in the case of Jews, the seed of Abraham and subject to the laws of the covenant rather than mere biology. What does that mean, Father? Could you help me
Well,
out a little bit?
there's a promise that is made to Abraham and his seed and his offspring. You know, the um, the crisis that we see right now with fatherhood, for example.
Okay.
Why is it all of a sudden now that it's happening? Well, it's because, in part, um, the biological model has shifted
Hmm.
how mankind has traditionally looked at having children, so
Hmm.
that it used to be that the father was the source of the children,
Yep.
and then they're kind of implanted in the woman, and she's sort of the fertile field and everything else, and the child comes forth from her, but it comes from the man. And so therefore, for example, divorce laws, if there was a divorce, the children used to stay with the father. Why? Because they're his children. They bear his name. They came from him. And when the emphasis is more becomes on fertility and the ovum and that, and it's, you see the sperm as well, there's just way too many of them, one just happens to get lucky and get in, then it's really the man isn't as important as the woman, and she's the one who's bearing all this stuff. Well, it's they're um the the traditional idea was always is that father position was the source of life. The father is the one who's coming down, and so your sexual contact is governed by the law of Moses and everything else, to show these things are holy because you're creating a holy people. You're not just here to woo have fun. This is, and you're not merely having sort of biological children, but this is you're bringing forth something that has been promised. God's commandment zero to Adam and Eve is to be fruitful and multiply and fulfill and subdue the earth. It's that's one of the first commandments right there, even before Moses comes out with 15 crash 10 commandments. That was the very first one. And sorry for my Mel Brooks reference. Brilliant comedian, by the way. But so God told man to do this, and so therefore, in Judaism, you're carrying out a divine commandment by getting married and having children. That's why Hasidic Jews have got huge families, because they believe that's what they're commanded to do by God. So that's kind of that's the direction that heads in. You see in the New Testament, Jesus doesn't contradict that. Actually, what he does, he takes a step further and says, you now have to go forth and preach the gospel. Even the people who are outside of Israel, you have to proclaim, like, when Isaiah talk about proclaiming the name of God, proclaim my fame. You're supposed to go out there, and the notion of just merely having biological kids isn't nearly as important as creating spiritual children, and bringing people to return to God, to worship Him, and reestablish that.
Hmm.
Um,
So is that why in was it Luke? Is it the genealogy of Christ is traced through Joseph, through the father, rather
All
than
all the genealogies go through the father. I mean, occasionally they'll mention by Uriah,
okay.
uh, you know, by this one, by that wife, but it's always through the father.
But
Even
that
oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
like so he was of the house of David, so that's how you
Hmm.
traced your line
Right.
through the yeah. The this is interesting too. You wrote male to male as well as female to female sexual contact is punished because it does not form the foundation of a household and in fact can destroy a home.
Hmm.
I want to show a picture here real quick. I want to share because when I read Father's work here, I'm reminded constantly of certain like pop culture stuff. So this is I remember when this came out, this ad. Who makes honey made crackers? Is it Nabisco or I don't know. But and that's supposed to be a very American like brand, honey made graham crackers. So this was a advertisement that came out, I think it was pre-Obergefell, or it might have been that year, like 2015 or 2016. But here you've got this very nice suburban sort of looking house. We've got the American flag here. And then we've got a same-sex couple, presumably married with a boy and a baby and a son, and then they're holding their honey-made graham crackers. How lovely! So this contradicts what uh, the Judaic tradition upholds, right, Father?
Sure. Oh yeah, it's pretty obvious, and that's because again, there's even when you look at marriage and how um it it manifests, there's a position for a husband, there's a position for a wife, and you automatically you start having to tamper with that. Very first tampering is with that, but then it goes on where you're going to have to get somebody else's kids because you can't have your own. Why? Because you have two males. Can't happen. Although people say that it can happen now, and all the rest of the lunacy we have going on these days. But um, what a lot of that stuff does, it kind of pantomimes something that's real. It's an imitation of it, but it isn't. It isn't really. That is something that still requires the a family, a household is a self-contained unit. And barring that there is an accident, whatnot, of infertility or whatnot, the most part is husband and wife come together and they have their children. But here you have two men, and there isn't that husband and wife role, or there is, but one of them has to kind of give up their natural born identity to kind of mirror it.
You're right.
um this is where the problem lies, is that what we say is that whether we like it or not, we're born with a certain way that we're supposed to kind of carry ourselves out in society and in life, and it matches up with our gifts that we're born with. Our look at what it is to, let's say, be a male. Now, some of us are more successful at being a male than others. That's understandable, but you at least try to do it. But when somebody comes around and says, well, um and this is where I wanted to kind of get into the whole thing about what is sex, what is sexuality, what is it? Is it just about that which you had a picture of, or is it about having a experience of physical pleasure? And where does it come from in us? Because it's there's some deep questions that are underneath all of this, that like you bring up that picture, it kind of, you start to tear back and you look inside, because what exactly is happening here?
Mm-hmm.
What is it? And it's, I think it's a direct result of, um, there's a number of problems that are at play. I think the very first one you run into is just, well, ask the question is what is the sexual drive? Is it an innate drive to have children? Well, I think if that was the case, we wouldn't have the infertility issues that we have nowadays. Let's say start there. We'd be a lot more like animals. Animals aren't really sexually active until, the male smells that a female's in heat, and then all of a sudden, and some kind of there's something that gets triggered, and then once that's over with, they don't
Yep.
care. There's something more profound that goes on within humans, but I would go so far as to say, when you talk about, let's say, take the kids out of this picture, these two men, are you sexually attracted to a male as a complete package, or is something else going on? Because the one thing I'm really fascinated by is the neurosciences and the discoveries are making about neurology, and things that we used to think were just strictly psychological processes are in fact, kind of software, or actually hardware. I'll give you an example. My premise is, from reading the sources that I have in the paper, everything else, is that sexuality is a sensory experience. It is something that is done with the senses in a very primitive part of the brain. And we're looking for very specific cues. There's a drive that comes up. There's this appetite that kind of comes up, and then it hits all of the complexities of our senses, and our senses are looking for certain things. And so when you are young and you're kind of going through that process where all that appetite is being awoken and it's hitting your senses, and your senses are trying to find something that is other, that you are supposed to bond with, and that other thing has certain attributes. So you start looking for those attributes, but you're not necessarily looking for that complete picture. You get back to the Greeks. Why were the Greeks into boys? And you think, oh, I don't know. It's a little odd. Why would they do that? Well, go back and read their poetry. Why they described boys as being like women. And we all know that women are okay. So what they saw was that boys were like women in the sense that they didn't have the hairiness. They weren't as, big and kind of gross and disgusting as adult men are. And plus they don't get pregnant, which means that you can carry on with a boy and he's not going to make your wife feel like she has a rival, because, what is the wife's, in a Greek society, what does the wife really do? Her big purpose is she bears the husband's children, right?
You actually talk about this, Father. Can we get to it in a minute?
Sure. I'm sorry. I'm like,
well, you it, so you know where your head's going. So I want to get, because I want to get to that exactly, because I know where you're going.
okay.
So but I want to get to this other point. Sorry,
Okay.
Father.
You can cut this out if you need to.
Throughout the Old Testament, Israel's abandonment to its physical appetites is likened to adultery and whoredom, culminating in pagan worship and social disorder. Sexual desires must be constrained in order to follow God, and sexual laxity is a manifestation of social chaos. Let's hope I got the right picture here. Okay. Father, I know this is crazy, but I blocked out part of it. But when I read that article, that paragraph, I thought of this picture. San Francisco Gay Pride Parade. I was there, so I was doing outreach that year. I'm going to say 20, that doesn't matter, 20, I don't know, let's say 16. So you had these two guys dressed up as angels.
Hmm.
Check out this young lady here. This is like a marriage of sort of weird pseudo religion, uh, combined with religiosity, strange Judeo-Christian symbolism, uh, slash corporate America. So you've got this young lady here, and Burger King was giving out these little crowns that year with um, the rainbow flag. But what I find most interesting is this young woman right here. So she's got a flower crown on. Her hands are sort of like in a prayerful
Hmm.
position. And I find this picture so fascinating. I think it's one of the most important photos of the 21st century. It's kind of everything that's going on and going wrong with American
Hmm.
culture. So it's like we're gay, sex, religion, pseudo occultism, corporate America has all kind of combined in this image. And I think that's what you're talking about, Father, in that paragraph where things start to go wrong sexually, sort of society sort of goes off the rails. You do have disorder, but then you have this weird kind of attempt because I think man instinctively needs order and structure. So then you have this weird sort of attempt because mainline Christianity has sort of failed, especially in the West. And you have this attempt by humanity to sort of figure it out. So here you've got this religion or this uh, spirituality that has emerged
Hmm.
in this picture.
Yeah. Well, it's I think it gets to the point of one of our biggest problems right now we have is that it's a sensory issue. Our senses are um, hyper let's say bombarded on a daily basis um, with there's like you take a look, just look at that picture again, look at all the colors that are in there, look at all of this kind of very intense um, uh, things that are going on visually in it. uh, what I one of the things that you kind of notice, I live in northern Idaho now, right? And so the average guy up here, they all kind of wear a uniform. It's this camouflage snapback baseball cap, either flannel shirt, or in the summer it's a camouflage t-shirt, pair of jeans, boots. That's it, and they're happy with that. You give them, you go to the store and you could put all of the wonderful colorful stuff up there. These guys are going to pick flannel, camouflage, denim. That's it. And so when they encounter something like this, they go, it's too much, and you recede from it. But there are some people that look at all of this and they have that kind of like, wow, this is great, that their senses are capable of handling all this, and this does something wonderful for them internally, and they want more. And the thing with this is we're getting back into the appetites, is that we're either attracted to something or we're kind of revolted by it, but we're revolted by it because it's overwhelming, it's too much, it's too strong. It's like you can put in a little bit of cologne, you smell nice, you pour the whole bottle on your face, wow. And so this is the thing that you see going on there, is that you have people who are really, this for them is a pleasurable moment. I'm kind of looking at it going like, oh, sunburn. But that's where all of this kind of stuff starts. And one of the things that are the you have that desire for it, and what do you want? You want more. You want more. You want more. And where the asceticism comes up in Christianity, starts with Judaism, comes into Christianity, is we say is the appetites don't stop. They don't have an off ramp. They only, you have to like put the brakes on them, because the moment, think about like, I use this all the time. What's the best meal you ever had? Oh, I had this great steak. I was at the steakhouse. I had a wonderful steak. I said, okay, after you had that steak and you put down the knife and the fork, you're done. You say, never need to have another steak again. That was the best. No, you're playing about like, looking in your wallet. When can I come back? Right.
Exactly.
And so, but the world tells you is you have all these appetites, you have all these desires, you need to live according to them. You need to fulfill them. Go out and do these things that you desire. And then people go out and do them. And they're kind of the back of their mind, they're saying, well, this should bring me peace. I should feel some kind of like contentment afterwards. Well, you get contentment for about 10 minutes and then you want more. And so all of the stuff, it gets more and more and more. I mean, you take a look, I'm sure if somebody went back and filmed gay pride, let's say celebrations from 20 years ago, they don't look like this.
No, I was there.
It's getting more.
Father.
Was it the same? Was it just like this?
No, it's not, Father.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is it's because that stuff's not going to work anymore. You have to go a step further.
It didn't have, it was certainly sexually centered, but it didn't have this religiosity aspect, and it didn't have the cooperation or the participation of non-gay people. So it's the culture has expanded to include everybody. So this is, sorry, Father, and I can always edit this stuff out later. This is too heavy for you. But hey, I figured you wrote this article and you touched on some pretty, controversial stuff.
And I grew up in Los Angeles. I was,
I know it's not shocking to you, but it's shocking to other people out there.
I'm sure.
So you wrote, so Judaism, well, specifically Christianity, is the social milieu is what it's in. It's in the Greco-Roman period. So you talk about the Greeks. They believed that, man, this is heavy stuff, Father. But the Greeks also believed that semen could be used to anoint a boy with power of manhood. I read that and I went, oh, I was like, okay, this is stuff that I've seen in the gay community for a long time. So this is from Twitter. I actually ran into these fellows when I was doing ministry down in San Francisco. So that sounds kooky there. Like they believe that stuff about semen. Well, today we've got this group of gay men, and there's a play on words there with communion. And so that's what they're playing with. And here's a fella in the meme praying. And so that mentality is still alive today.
Oh yeah, the devil, the devil doesn't have as many tricks as you'd think. He has to recycle. Yeah, there has always been kind of a sex and religion go back. This is also what it was tied to, like abortion and child sacrifice and all this kind of stuff. You have, when you go back to like the ancient Near East, there was this notion that you had to sacrifice your firstborn to the gods, right? And this is where you get into the Saturn worship and all that, and sacrificing a child. Well, let's think about this for a moment, is that if the male seed is where the child comes from, right? Very soon they figured out, well, here's an interesting thought about this is, well, I have to sacrifice a child. What if I sacrifice a child before a child's actually been born?
Wow.
So let's say, for example, you're in a temple, and the question of why did temples have prostitutes? Well, what was the prostitute doing? She was collecting from the men. She has a child. Then that child is offered. Which one of the men sired this child? Well, they all kind of are. And so the man gets credit for making the sacrifice to the gods. He sacrificed a child by going into the temple prostitute. And
that still goes on today.
oh yeah,
Wow,
oh
that's
yeah.
heavy, Father. Yeah. The world is messed up. So, this is Harvey Milk. He had a relationship with several underage boys.
Oh,
Harvey Milk is like the patron saint of gays. So he's had a postage stamp in the United States. He was in the Navy at one time, so he's even had a Navy ship named after him. But he was, I don't know, he was a child molester or pederast. I don't know what you'd call him.
hmm.
There it is. So I put that in there because Father talked about the connection in early, in Greek society and even somewhat in Rome between homosexuality and pederasty. Here is Harry Hay. He was the founder of the Mattachine Society, the first founded in LA. He was
Mm.
the uh, that was the
Blech.
first gay rights group in the United States, and he was a NAMBLA supporter. Allen Ginsberg, very famous beat poet, wrote how a very large figure in LGBT history. Here's James Martin, that vile preacher. I'll talk about him a little bit later with your father if you want to. Here he is talking about how wonderful Allen Ginsberg was. Allen Ginsberg, I'm a member of NAMBLA because I love boys too. Well, not too much has changed since the Greeks. So this is, I kind of like when I was reading your article, Father, and then you mentioned Zeus and uh, different depictions of Zeus, and one
Mm.
that you talked about was Ganymede. And I kind of had a fascination that I wanted to get your take on this. Since I was at Berkeley studying art history, uh, uh, is it a basilica? There's a basilica in France, Our Lady, not Our Lady, Sainte Mary Magdalene, in Vézelay, France. And they've got these, it's a Romanesque cathedral, and they've got these capitals, these columns, excuse me. And then at the top are these capitals. So people would be familiar with like Corinthian columns in Greece or acanthus leaf ones in Rome. So in this church, this Christian church, what's the dates on that? 1120 to 1150. Um, there's a carved depiction of the rape of Ganymede. And for the life of me, I could never figure out why in a Christian church they're portraying the rape of a boy. Um, so I did a little digging. Not exactly contemporaneous, but he died in 1073. There was Peter Damian, and he wrote a book. What was it called, Father? It was about sodomy in the Catholic Church.
Mm.
And so I don't know if this is all fitting together, but it's interesting that you had mentioned all this stuff concerning homosexuality and the gods and the rape of Ganymede, and then 1,000 years later, here it is in a Catholic cathedral.
Well, there's still, there's medieval Europe was kind of, awash in Greek texts. That was part of what, the Renaissance was about, was getting reintroduced to all of that Greek literature, and it was on people's minds. This is one of the dangers. In fact, you'll see, like, if you want to call it a danger, but with the in our church with people who were reading a lot of Plato, and there was a temptation to become Platonist in some of your interpretations of Christian thought, because that's what you were, so there's, when you're reading that kind of stuff, it kind of, it sticks with you, and it's very hard to kind of lose it, so but then you think about it, well, were those construction workers reading Greek literature? Most of those guys were illiterate, so somebody's actually telling them to carve that stuff up there.
Good.
Here, I want you to put this bird and this, and this guy and all that. But that these, the things that are going on that you see in Greek society that people turn to nowadays to explain what they're doing now, they're not, what they're not looking at is the full historical text, because the Greeks understood the danger of what they were getting themselves into, which was why there was rules. A young man could only be sexually passive as a boy, and as soon as he hit puberty, he was done with that, and he was expected to not have that. He was supposed to go out and get married, and then only came back later as an older man, where he was supposed to have the wisdom and everything else that he could engage in one of these pederast relationships. But what happened is, by the time you get to the Romans got rid of the whole thing that you're trying to teach them anything. The Romans saw it as kind of just a sexual relationship. So they would hire, to take a slave boy, they would buy him and they'd use him. And then the whole thing was, at the end of it, he would get set free, and he would get his education paid for. But the Orthodox Church, the canons, there's actually a canon about like young men who are used that way couldn't be ordained. They're actually, if you'd been a catamite for like a Roman senator, you couldn't be ordained. And they kind of gave some, so, well, if as long as he wasn't penetrated, if there was just kind of interfemoral kind of thing going on, but if he was penetrated, no. And there was an idea that if a child is sexualized in that way, that it becomes very hard for that not to carry on later in life, and especially if you're in ministry, in the priest in the church, there was a high probability that you'd be facing some temptations that you'd fall to, and that could be destructive not only for your soul, but the souls of other people who are in the church.
What was strange, Father, too, is I've heard from some Catholic pre-sex abuse survivors that have said, because this is post 1054, so I was wondering also if there's like something with the filioque here, with the symbolism of the bird and the Holy Spirit, because some pre-sex abuse survivors, like I said, have told me that was actually utilized in terms of their grooming process. That the Holy Spirit is the result of the union between Christ and the Father, so that there's an interplay between all of that symbolism, and it's used in terms of the grooming process, which is strange. So I don't know if that was going around in the 12th century Europe. I don't know. But
I don't know. I mean, it's if you want to juxtapose, the Holy Spirit comes as a dove, it's gentle, versus in the Greek mythology, Zeus comes, he transforms as first as I think as a bull, and then the second time as he transforms, it's an eagle. It's a predatory bird. So that Ganymede is predated. He's hunted down by an animal that is a bird of prey. So I think that it's kind of a perversion of, if you want to compare it to the Holy Spirit, it's a perversion of that. It's an inversion.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, Father.
No, go ahead.
And I've also heard from some survivors, that's why I wanted to talk about, or we talked about earlier, about the sort of anointing aspect in Greek society, that sometimes with survivors have told me that there's also like a sacrilegious aspect. to their abuse. And I wonder if that had survived as well in Catholicism, so Roman Catholicism.
I think that instinctively with humans, the law is written in our hearts.
Mm,
God made us a certain way. And so we kind of instinctively know when we're transgressing, when we're crossing lines.
mm,
And so it's natural for us when we do that to ritualize things.
mm,
You look at what you've been talking about, kind of the progress of the gay movement as going from kind of a political movement, and as it's transforming into something that's religious, and that's naturally what things do. Is secular activities invariably become religious.
mm.
You look at the Soviets when they took over; they smashed the churches, burned the icons, and then what did they do? They replaced all of it with their own. So you had icons. I mean, there's very clearly Soviets had very clear iconography.
Yeah.
They had rituals. We do that as human beings. It's the way that we kind of formalize, and I guess in some ways say excuse our behavior.
Father, I know we're going a little over on time. How are you doing?
I'm fine.
Okay.
I on and on and on. I can.
Okay. I do this all the time. Father, you wrote here in Christianity, it should not be surprising that the New Testament spends little time directly addressing the matter of sex. Judaism had settled the matter as divine law, which we have already covered, and Jesus Christ was not an abolisher of the law.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted you to see, because when I read that, I thought of something else. There's a Catholic, Roman Catholic priest, Jesuit, named James Martin. I think some Catholics kind of dismiss him, but because I've interviewed a bunch of Catholic priests, I think they underestimate his power and influence, because I've had Catholic priests say, I can't discuss James Martin on a podcast. I can talk about him, you know, between you and I, Joe, but I can't discuss him.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one time here in San Francisco, I can't recall, I can't recall which diocese, but James Martin had arranged to give an address at a parish and talk about homosexuality. And I had called a chancery office. Now that I mention, I can't remember if it was San Francisco or not. And I talked to someone. I said, I have some concerns about him and what he's going to say. And they were like, well, we can't touch him. I was like, okay, well, there we go. So here I want to share screen with Father, and I wanted to get his reaction to this.
Francisco is asking, how can one respond to persons citing Leviticus and Corinthians text condemning homosexuality?
Yeah, so all these Bible passages that people throw at you, I think really need to be understood in their historical context, right? I mean, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and even the stuff from the New Testament where Paul talks about it, once or twice, has to be understood in the historical context, right? The Bible is written in a particular time. It's the inspired word of God, but it is written certainly in a particular time and in a particular historical context. Certainly in Old Testament times, they didn't understand the phenomenon of homosexuality and bisexuality, I would say, as we do today. I also like to say that there's a lot of other stuff in Leviticus that we, sort of understand in its historical context, like what kind of slaves can we have, that kind of stuff. Whether or not we can wear certain kinds of clothes, whether or not our crops can be next to one another. We don't look at those passages in an ahistorical way, so why should we look at passages on homosexuality in that way? And I'd also like to say that in his long ministry, his 3-year public ministry, Jesus says nothing about the topic. So when people use those arguments at you, I think it's an important one needs to remind them that those things need to be understood in their context, as we understand everything in the Gospels.
What a snake!
Yeah.
So, let me just before I get Father's reaction. Number one, the Jews were terribly unenlightened and uninformed about the concept of homosexuality, but I guess in Martin's brain, the Greeks were much more, closer to what, we would, consider acceptable. So don't listen to the Jews and well, Jesus didn't say anything about it. Therefore, vis-a-vis, he was okay. But he didn't talk about porn. He didn't talk about, what else didn't he talk about? I don't know. He didn't talk about a whole bunch of other stuff. But I guess porn is okay too.
Yeah, no, I find people like him is just annoying because it's transparently condescending. Those ignorant savages living on the dunes, all the tents and all that, and we're the erudite ones, we're the wise, very smart people. We are very scientific. I mean, all this stuff is perfectly okay. I mean, Jesus said, "Go out and have a good time," didn't he? Go to the pub. Pick up a lad. No, golly, it's just stop. Yes, I'm a firm believer in historical context, and that's why I actually read history and find that what he was saying is, is flat out wrong. In many ways, the Romans, for example, were had, let's say, greater demand of sexuality, for sexuality, let's say, being as a social value. That you had to get married, you had to have children, you had to be a strong man. They demanded it. And if you didn't do those things, you risked, going back to the Greeks, with losing your citizenship. There was actually the Romans, for example, the punishment for seducing another man's wife was death, or that the offending man had to, let's just say, do something of a favor for the husband whose wife he had his dalliance with, and it was in public, and he was shamed as a result. The Greeks and the Romans were far stricter than what people say these days. Even, for example, the notion of carrying on with a boy, there was still a notion that you didn't just simply use him for your he was looked down upon if you're using him strictly for pleasure, that you were supposed to he was supposed to come out of the arrangement better for it. Yeah. Now this stuff is all just strictly I, me, I want this, I want that, I want whatever I want. And there is no notion of how does this make the world better? How does this make society better?
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, there's still a pagan aspect to all this, because I know from my own experience and the experience of a lot of other people, is that when a young man in particular goes into the gay male community, they're often paired up with an older, wealthier, more educated, more experienced man. And hence, you're supposed to, like in the pagan days, come out of it better off.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you do, sometimes you come out of that with HIV, so you don't come out of it better off. I like this. I like what you wrote here. Jesus, in his praise of St. John, condemns the effeminate indulgence of the upper classes in the Roman world. Hence, his pointing to the king's houses or places where the effeminate gather. St. John is not praised for being heterosexual, but rather ascetic in the Old Testament tradition. He's not soft, but hardy, in the sense that he carries out a severe ascetic struggle for the sake of God. And the effeminate man will not do such a thing, since he indulges his senses and thus his passions. I thought that was cool because I hadn't really thought of St. John the Baptist. I never thought of him in that way.
Hmm.
So I thought that was really cool. And one of the things I noticed in Orthodoxy too, because I'm interested in art. Of course, there's a lot of icons of our Lord. There's a lot of icons of the Theotokos, Our Lady. There's a lot of icons of St. John the Baptist, even from period things in his life, his birth,
Hmm.
the birth of John, and his death. So there's a lot. You don't see that in Catholicism.
Mm.
You might see Saint Joseph a lot,
Hmm.
but Saint John you see a lot in Orthodoxy. I think it's an interesting example of masculine virtue, and but
Hmm.
I like that you had you had talked about that. So I've been thinking of him differently now. So, and this is very much like opposed to what what was going on in the ancient world was that masculine men and also these effeminate boys who get I would say abused. So
Hmm.
you don't have that in Judaism.
No,
So
what it is young. What I see happening right now is um, we're we're bombarded with this hyper imagery, like you just saw with the gay pride parade picture that you had there. You're bombarded with it. You're a young person, you're a kid, and you're all of a sudden your hormones are kicking in, and you're seeing all of this stuff, and you don't know how to process it.
mm,
And so you think, well, I must be, you have a young man, and let's say, for example, he's very sensitive. He's, and he doesn't, the rest of the boys are kind of like I was describing, the guys up here in Northern Idaho, camouflage, denims, this, and that. He doesn't like that stuff. The material's too coarse. It's not colorful enough. And so you go and there's these guys that are over here and they're doing all this stuff and it's colorful and it's exciting and all that. And you want to be part of that. And, you know, so we see nowadays young people are being alienated because they see this hyper reality in their computer screens and their telephones and all that, and they compare it to themselves and they become dissatisfied. If you're a young woman these days, you're seeing all of these highly processed images of women, and they've had surgeries and all this kind of stuff, and you look at yourself and you're just kind of like, you're average.
like
You're like,
yeah,
and you
Kim Kardashian.
yeah, so you look at that and you compare yourself as well. I mean, it's like me trying to compare myself to Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, right? You look at a guy, the muscle definition, not tall, dark and ugly, and so I must, if that's a man, and I don't feel like that. This is that sensory thing about my body, my senses. My senses establish who I am and where I am in the world. And you say, well, if I don't feel like that, I don't look like that, I must be something else. What are my alternatives? And this is where all of the social contagion is going on now with all of this trans stuff, is because, nobody's simply saying the honest truth, which is we all go through an awkward phase. We all go through a point where we don't feel like ourselves. And what you do is you just kind of get used to it. And eventually that goes away. Now, there are some people that feeling of being not comfortable in skin never goes away. And, as someone who has, throughout my whole life struggled with kind of a feeling that I don't fit in with other people, you can call that autism. Several of my children have been diagnosed with that, and but there's a thing where you just kind of learn to like ignore that. The fathers, the ascetics teach you, don't trust your senses, don't trust that everything your senses are telling you is exactly the truth. That the truth is something that's beyond just what your senses will tell you. So you learn, like, when you feel out of place and you feel awkward, don't pay attention to that. But now when you tell people, oh, you absolutely, everything that you feel you have to take absolutely seriously, well, guess what you're going to do? You're going to go into the surgeon and say, give me the drugs and give me the surgery. We're and more of the kids, whether there's social pressure to fit in, and if you pick one of the letters of the alphabet, you get to fit in with all the other kids, and you're not a bad white kid anymore. Okay, you'll do that. I think it was just recently, I don't know if you picked up on the news, they did a study of like college students. They said like this college students, like 20, majority of the college students identify as one of the letters on the alphabet there. But what's funny is when you actually ask them what they're doing,
Yeah.
their activities don't match up with what they say that they are. And it's just, it's kind of, oh, well, that's a little odd, don't you think? You'd think if you were picking up on that letter, you'd be going out and doing, especially in college where they're practically, they'll practically drive you there and back for free.
It's like LARPing. Because when I haven't done it a lot lately, but when I outreached in San Francisco at all the Pride events, there was a lot of young people there, and a lot of them said, "Well, yes, I'm lesbian," or "Yes, I'm gay." But I said, "Really? Is that really it?" No, they're not. It's just, I guess it's cool. Yeah. So, I mean, when I came out during the AIDS era, it wasn't cool at all. Yeah, it wasn't cool. Father, you wrote, "Effeminacy is a moral failing and not simply a choice in style." Do you remember
mm-hmm.
that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Could you just a little bit? I agree with you, but what give me more.
It's the same thing. For example, okay, what is the notion of effeminacy is not just simply that you're particularly, let's say, it's different from like sensitivity. Effeminacy is where one begins to put on airs. It's not actually what it is to be feminine, because like as a man, you don't know what it is to be a female because you don't have all the chemicals and the equipment. Your brain's different. The best that you can do is guess, and it becomes a caricature. So that's why, that's what's kind of funny is that the trans movement has really gone in the direction of the drag queen, which is a complete mischaracterization of femininity. It has nothing to do with that. I mean, I wouldn't look at a drag queen and go, "Oh, that's a beautiful woman there." You don't see that on the cover of Cosmo, even if you put a real woman under all that stuff. So, but effeminacy, when you talk of being soft, it's giving into that softness, and therefore, which is a lack of self-control, a lack of discipline, self-discipline, which actually, it's funny is we really need that, because if you're going to do all the rest of the stuff, like, oh, you should be, if you get into like the other stuff with the woke, and well, you should be anti-racist. Well, that's a form of asceticism. You think about it, you've got to like police every single word that comes out of your mouth. You got to think about, where are you buying your stuff from? If you have certain thoughts, you're expected to suppress them. And it's really funny that on the one hand, they'll preach freedom, but on the other hand, they preach something that is an interior struggle. And so what effeminacy is about is this notion of just kind of supposedly letting go of all these strictures on your activities and your experiences. But we all really know deep down that we don't want that. We don't.
I was hoping that's what you would say, because that's what I was thinking, that effeminacy is an absence of these masculine virtues of self-discipline. And you wrote that here. The monks understood that only divine intervention could transform a man from being a prisoner of his vices into a man free from his passions. So, and I wanted to show these couple of pictures because I think they kind of encapsulate that idea. Not James Martin; he's the antithesis. So John the Baptist, I think very much encapsulate that. And this guy, in my mind kept going back to him. This is Father Stephen Rose. So a man who certainly dealt with his own passions, but like the monk said, like you wrote, the monks understood that only divine intervention could transform a man from being a prisoner of his vices into a man free from his passions. That's Father Seraphim Road right there.
Mhm.
So that's a man right there. That's a masculine man. But I'd say probably didn't certainly start out that way, but through the grace of God and through his own cooperation, he certainly got there.
Yeah, well, the Romans had a weird way of squaring that circle. I was reading one of the books I was reading there. There was a story about like a Roman senator, and he used to sit at his or recline at table. They used to, eat at a low table, kind of lay down on pillows, whatnot. He'd recline at table wearing women's clothing. And what the Roman approach to that was, well, is he married? Does he have children? Did he serve? Does he serve honorably in the Senate? Does he, do all the other masculine things? It's like, as long as you do all the other masculine things, you were allowed to kind of be profligate. Julius Caesar was, seen by the Romans as being kind of a man's man, and yet he also engaged in, same-sex intercourse. And in fact, on the passive side, you go like, oh my goodness, how could he do that and get away with it? And it was, well, because he was a conquering hero. They said, first of all, he'd seduced half the wives of the senators, in the Roman Senate. And as long as he could prove that he could be a bigger man than anybody else, he could do this stuff. And, Judaism, this is the thing about Judaism, never equates masculinity with sexual conduct. Judaism equates masculinity with being brave and being courageous and following the law. And you see this come down through Christ. Christ doesn't talk about how to be a man. He doesn't. He doesn't say, here's how you have to be a man. Here's how you have to be a woman. Jesus doesn't do those things. Why? Because it's all very clear in that world. Those roles were well defined, and what you didn't want to do is backslide into stuff that the Old Testament condemned. But this is you see now in our society this kind of struggle for what is masculine. There's all these guys now that are coaches out there. They're coaching people on how to be men, and it's like, why are you so disconnected from yourself?
Lack of masculine role models during childhood.
Yeah, that, and I think also because you're hammered with so much imagery that is contrary to it.
Oh, like you mean the toxic masculinity stuff? That's
well, you're not even that, but you're it when you go like camping, for example, you notice how many luxuries you start giving up to go out in the woods, right? I think most men they see a guy who's rough and tumble, and deep down they kind of go, I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I can go a week without a shower. What if I don't have my hair product? I had one of my angry, dad moments with my son because, his mother, buys his deodorant, stuff like that. And she was going to the store and he says, I need more hair product. I came out of my cave, angry bear dad. Women talk about hair product. You just talk about shampoo, damn it. I might have to censor the D word there. But there's we live in such an age of ease. We have everything so easy, and we know how vulnerable that is. We know how delicate that is. On the other hand, we wail against it and beat on it. But I think we're kind of lost because I think a lot of young people, they don't even know how to live without these things. I went to a workshop recently. I was out in the woods, and so I took a blacksmithing class, and so I'm in there. I'm beating on a piece of steel and trying to turn it into a knife, and And at one point, the guys will start, crying, "Oh, I can't use my belt sander." And I'm like, wimp. Because the place we're at didn't have like any like electric power, we're out in the woods, right? It was like working on, and, and it's a, men we're constantly comparing ourselves to others. And then we say, I don't know if I can measure up. I don't know if I can do this. And yeah, lack of male role models. I mean, this is universal. I mean, I just look in my little town here at how many men are actually raising their own sons.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness, it's very few.
Mm-hmm.
If they are raising their son, they've also got somebody else's son in the house. The disruption of family life is even amongst people who are, quote unquote Christian. It's horrendous.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to get to something because I'm hoping that this conversation isn't disjointed, because I felt like the conversation we're having about, masculinity, not so much femininity, but the attributes of the sexes is related to what you write here. The difference between men and women help to provide the natural counterbalance to one another to prevent excess. And then you go into how between men and women it can be a struggle, but they learn from each other because they're the different, but they're also harmonious.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to share my screen real quick. I got to that realization from a weird place. There's Father Seraphim Rose. Again, they didn't have hot water up there in Platina. They didn't have heat. So that was roughing it, let me tell you.
Mm-hmm.
This is from one of my favorite authors, Randy Shills. He wrote the book and the band played on. He died in 94 from AIDS. But he wrote, because he was trying to figure out why things kind of went so wrong in the gay male community, because I know kind of AIDS and stuff is kind of far removed from people's minds right now,
Mm-hmm.
because of all this psyop that they're doing. They were doing a lot of psyops leading up to Obergefell, the cookie thing that I showed earlier, and people like Ellen DeGeneres, gay people, they're just, they're, as American as mom and apple pie and all that stuff. There was a real effort to whitewash everything about gay, but back in the 90s, gay guys were dropping like flies because of this disease, and people like Randy Schultz were trying to figure it out. I was like, well, how did this happen?
Mm-hmm.
Why did this disease hit gay men? Why? Well, he said, because there is no moderating role that a woman plays in the heterosexual milieu. That's what he said.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought of that in the context of your article there, because
Mm-hmm.
that's what Father's talking about. And I think this all kind of fits together because, there are masculine attributes, there are certain feminine attributes. Those can get very much confused. I mean, if you look at in the Greco-Roman world, there's sort of this weird, blending,
Mm-hmm.
and not blending, but I would say blurring of the lines, like you talked about with young boys between femininity and masculinity, and I think we're kind of seeing that today again. But
Mm-hmm.
those sex differences are there for a reason, and God put them there for a reason. It's not arbitrary. So
No, and the thing that this may seem controversial to some, when you take a look at, let's say, the homosexual, using scare quotes, the homosexual male in America is, in fact, in some ways, he's way more male in certain ways than the quote unquote heterosexual man. And it's because the brakes are off. You can do whatever you feel like. And if your appetites are coming up through a male sensory world that's also hypersensitive, that's what I think is if you want to really get into the differences between people, it's levels of sensitivity to their physical stimuli. You know, the guy who says he's gay, he sees the world in much greater color, and there's much more pleasure in it and all that, and he wants more and more and more of it, and he's got all the male drives. So yeah, you're gonna go and you're gonna do everything to everything. And that's the wonderful gift of male and female, is that, you know, that there's your brakes. The woman says, no, you know, not tonight. Oh, and by the way, you need to check your attitude. You know, oh yeah, that's right. I'm getting out of line. So what women do by counterbalancing men and men counterbalancing women is we actually put the brakes on our appetites. And so then we become real. You know, we're not just living for the next dosage of stimuli. And so it becomes, that's why sex is supposed to be inside the marriage.
Yep.
People get freaked out when they look at the penitential books, like the Examonogatarian, and they look and they go like, well, how come the penances for male to male contact is the same as male to female contact? Why aren't the penances that much different? And he'd say, well, it's because the thing that's missing there is that you're doing something outside of marriage. Who you're doing it with isn't really the issue. The issue is that you're defiling your marriage.
Yep.
And so the levels of defiling your marriage are what determine the level of the penance, not who you're defiling it with. They almost don't care.
Yeah.
Other than like if you're talking about, like, you know, dealing with levels of consanguinity, you know, you're approaching, you know, the things like, say, incest, whatnot, that have different penances. But you know, acting out of marriage, outside of that marital bond, is where the real problem lies. It isn't about your attraction.
Father, I kind of saved this for last, because I want to agree with you, but I kind of want to disagree with you.
Okay.
You wrote, can a man attracted to other men be counseled out of his perception? I would say the way you formed that question there, I would say no.
Mm-hmm.
No. But because reading the article, I was wondering, does Father think, because I'm not sure, does Father think that homosexuality is an innate characteristic? I'm not sure. I kind of think he doesn't think that. But I wasn't sure.
Here's what this is from reading what I've read and trying to make it all line up. I don't think that there is innate homosexual or heterosexual. I don't think those are categories. I think what there is a sexual appetite that comes up within us. Okay, we all have it, and it is common, and it is the same for males as it is for females. It's just a human trait, and it comes up and it enters the realm of the senses. The fathers teach us that our consciousness is kind of set up with two kind of general categories: thoughts, logizmi, your thoughts and ideas and things like that pop into your head. And then the other thing is the senses. And that's why the fathers talk about guarding the senses. So your senses are then responsible for doing what? Determining what you are, who you feel like you are. And then what is that over there? How far is it away? What is that? And do I want it or not? So now you're talking about, this is where like the scriptures talk about, the smell is pleasant to the nose. It's a delight to the eyes. It's very organ based, but it was a notion that those things are innate. So if you are let's say a man who, you're a young man and you're coming up and you're trying to find what it is that you want, and you encounter, let's say, you're not going to encounter a man or a woman. Your brain doesn't work that way. Those are high level thoughts. Definition of male and female. It's like one of the things that's very important for kids to form is what that is. But what we tend to do is look at male and female as a collection of attributes. And so you could be attracted to a certain attribute. So, for example, the Greeks were attracted to the attribute of smooth skin, something that's delight to touch, right? And so they would praise young boys, for example, as having the skin of women. And that was the source of the attraction, is that they're like women. So if you are let's say what we would consider to be a gay man, there are attributes of the male body that you find physically stimulating, that when you see them, when you perceive them, it does something for you that it doesn't do for me, right? And so that experience changes how you're going to approach your sexual desire, because you're looking for that thing. And this is why you'll find that there can be sexual crossover. For example, men can who have a preference for women can still have regular marital intercourse with a wife and have children, all that, but deep down they really want something else. But it isn't that you are organically looking for a man. What it is sensorily speaking, you're more stimulated by certain attributes that you tend to find in men.
That's aesthetics you're talking about? So some people just have a preference for a certain look, for how things look.
Sure. It does something. It's not an intellectualized process. It goes down. It's sublingual. It's below language, and it is a sensory thing.
Yeah.
And I think with, like, for example, the whole thing about bringing young boys into the gay world through grooming, it's you take a young man who's kind of like doesn't know, and he's lots of things feel good and this and that, and then you introduce him to that stuff, and then you get him to develop, and this is what the thing that the fathers talk about, is that you can awaken appetites. You take a young man who's kind of in that, he's trying to figure out sensory wise what is pleasurable and what is not, and then you like soak him in the other stuff, so you gradually become more and more exposed. This is what's going on, like in the schools, as they realize is the typical kid will look at, let's say the gay stuff, and they go, oh, it's too much, it's overwhelming, I don't want that. So they realize we got to get them earlier while they're still developing that sense, and expose them and feed that, so that it's just like if you raise your kids on food that's plain, and then they turn 18 and you dump a bottle of sriracha all over their food. It burns my mouth. Versus like the little kids from India, right? They get the good food, and they're raised on, like, straight up cayenne peppers, right in the bottle. I've made that mistake going to Indian restaurants and saying, I'll have it your way, and whoa. You got to work your way up to that. And that's the way it is with all of this the sexuality stuff is that you got to work your way up to it, because, we do the same thing. Cigars, right? I remember as guys, I got to try this cigar. Once, yuck. It's terrible. Why? Because I was getting some kind of, Honduran, thing that tasted like it had tar shingles in it. But then finally somebody introduced me like, oh, here's a real mild cigar. And I go, hey, well, I like cigars now all of a sudden. Why? Because I got a mild one. I can handle it.
Yeah.
But the grooming thing is about this, is rolling these kids into exposing them gradually to all of this world so that they can handle the big stuff that's at the end of the tunnel. Versus if you just throw them straight into a gay club, you're come out like, whoa, no, this is way too much. I get it. I can't get it. But you're like, how did those guys get in there to begin with? Well, they came in one step at a time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. I've already kept you way too long. Let me respond to a couple of things you said, because you said, a bunch of things that are really important. Because I used to be a great believer, like Lady Gaga, that you're born this way, that you were born gay. And I had Catholic priests that say, oh, God made you gay and you have certain attributes that, some are, very good. You might be more sensitive, like Chuck Taylor, or more artistic or more intuitive, or, whatever. So, so I believed all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
When later I started reading more about psychology and the causes of homosexuality, I saw that the majority, especially gay men, but this is also with lesbians, is that they experienced uh, molestation, sexual abuse as children. I was thinking there's something there, and also because I think it also has to do with aesthetics too. That like the Greeks just thought a certain type of physical body was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
But I think also this is where the grooming comes in. I think abuse, because let's look at Greece, for example. These young boys, they didn't have any choice whether to enter into this relationship or not. They were ushered into it. Now, I would argue that probably those guys doing the grooming and the abusing, they had also gone through that as well, because it was a cultural aspect of that society. So you have the continuation of that too. And all of this stuff, I just want to say, has survived too, because I remember Milo Yiannopoulos before he got canceled. And I kind of thought he was an interesting character, but then I stopped following him. But I remember when he was supporting Trump, he did this Twinks for Trump thing. And for people that don't know, without getting too descriptive, there is a sort of sub fetish or cult fetish or whatever, subculture or whatever, in the gay community that sort of likes this ephebic boy, and they call it Twinks. And so that still goes on. But so there is sort of this weird, what do they call it? Interconnection, or I don't know, between, I guess, certain aesthetics, but also abuse and grooming and psychological, maladjustment that just all kind of comes together. See what I'm saying, Father?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I think with molestation, as I mentioned earlier about the canons about priests, priestly candidates, and whether they had been as catamites, whether they had been penetrated or not. One's exposure and opening into the sexual world has long-term consequences. Think about, like, you don't like a particular flavor, particular thing, because of the first time you encountered it, you had a really bad experience. That's normal. That's normative. It's the same way for molestation survivors. They've been molested. They've been exposed to that sexual experience in a really traumatic way that damages how they're going to process that from that point forward. It's very different from, let's say, a rape victim who had normal sexual relations for years and then has a negative one, you could still kind of have something to go back to. But when your base experience is a horrendous injury, it's naturally going to distort things.
Yeah. Yep. I want to end my discussion. I could talk for 3 more hours. You wrote this towards the end of the article. And I probably mentioned about a quarter of the stuff that I highlighted. The Christian definition of sexual conduct does not bend to our desire, but actually stands in opposition to them. Because if the sexual appetites go unopposed, they will run rampant. And that's what, here we are. Are any sexual appetites nowadays unopposed? Not really. So here we are.
We're in a wild time. It is really wild.
And there's a proliferation of sexual fetishes that become identities. And that's why we have so many different identities, because people just don't have a certain kink. They actually have an identity too.
Well, it gives you, by having that identity, you get to plug into this, a quote unquote community. You get to feel like you're part of, even though you're sitting by yourself with your phone. And it's, but it gives purpose to life. Most people don't know why they exist. They have no idea why they exist. And so you exist to do what? To buy things, to be a consumer. Corporations are getting in on all this. Why? Because they see consumers. They see consumers. That's all that they see. And there's a few of them that have probably more nefarious reasons for doing this stuff. And there's some really dark things that are out there as well. But we're in an age now that I think we're about at the tipping point with all this. I think that there's going to be what I see that kind of brings me hope is there's a lot of kids that are out there that, despite being soaked in all this stuff, reject it. And they're you're seeing some cases where the kids are kind of like why are you grown-ups doing this to us? Because kids know when adults are being selfish.
Yeah. And don't people, because I see this in a lot of conservatives, is like some of the people that you mentioned too, the conservatives, they kind of like have focused on the trans. Like before the T thing happened, everything was okay. But the gays are really what started this. And you kind of discussed this in the beginning of the article, where because I mean, this isn't a vulgar article, but you're quite detailed about this stuff. And in the gay community, sexual positions became identities. They did it first. So this is where all this stuff comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of talk about that in this article. So I think the conservative community, I think a lot of times they tend to be law-abiding people. So when gay marriage became law in this country, I think it became okay. So I think they've jumped on board that. So they're trying to blame the T for everything. That's my rant, Father.
No, most people who I run into who are conservative conservatives are the ones that say, leave me alone. I just want to be left alone. That's, and I'm certainly one of those kind of like, just please leave me alone kind of a thing. And that was how, the whole thing with the gay movement was, it was a very gradual turning up of the temperatures, just a little bit at a time. And we just want to be left alone. We just want to be able to do our thing. We want to go to our little clubs and do our stuff. And it's boiling the frog, and it's going a little bit. And, conservatives don't have this revolutionary idea of changing the world and all that. Whenever they start getting that way, everybody makes fun of them. They go back into their box, just leave me alone. And versus kind of where you have like the far left progressivism, it's about progress. It's about like, that's why the gay flag is getting crowded out by the new colors that are coming in there. We got to get those out of the way because those have become stable, and we have to, I'm sure you've listened to James Lindsay, and stuff that he's doing on that, which is it's really interesting to get into stuff because I did some readings in Marxism, and it was really helpful to him to kind of connect the dots with this stuff in Marxism. But we're in this the gay movement came about over decades and decades. But if you take a look at guys like Foucault, Foucault was a pedophile, but what was his masquerading as? Oh, I'm just poor gay man, and I'm and it plays into kind of the pity kind of thing. But
he died of AIDS. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, he left Paris, went to San Francisco. Bad move, Michelle. Right in the middle of the epidemic. So, the one thing that we're fighting though is the further you go down the line is the more you're fighting nature. And just like the kids who are saying I'm part of the alphabet, but they're not actually acting out on it, that means that those kids are not invested in this. And as soon as they don't have to be invested in anymore, it's going to go away real fast.
I hope so.
And my thing, let's say, that I hope for with our church and everything else is that when this does fall apart, when this does come apart, we're going to have a lot of mutilated people.
Yeah.
And I am hoping that that we are stirred to some compassion and realize that we're going to be dealing with people who have tremendous amounts of regret, things that they're never going to be able to fix, that they have broken because they have been lied to. And I hope that instead of choosing, suicide, either slow or fast, that they will turn to God, and they will come to the church, and we can, show them a way out. The most damaging thing we can have is people say, "Oh, we just have to be accepting of them as they are." No. If they want to do that stuff, go right on ahead. You can go out there and do whatever it is. But we come to the church not because we want to get, and this goes for everybody. This is just a universal principle. You don't come to the church to get validated. You come to the church to repent. And that goes for validation of politics and your ideas and your appetites and everything else. We come to repent all of that. We give it all up for Christ. And if you say, I'm not a sinner, and, very first thing, people come to confession. Well, Father, I'm really a good person. I said, well, then you don't belong here. Get out. This is where you go to kind of struggle with the fact that you just realize that you're in a colossal jerk and you're in trouble. Or at least that's been my struggle. That's what I think that we need to do is to look at these things so that when these people come to us and say help, that we can actually lead them to Christ.
Yeah, I have certainly been welcomed in Orthodoxy. I haven't found, pride masses or LGBT ministries or, priests wearing rainbow vestments. That I haven't found, which I found in Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
What I have found is the truth. And like you, Father, this is sort of bizarre because I have found a lot of Orthodox priests willing to talk about these tough subjects. I think it's because they're married, and I think it's because they're not personally invested in it, and they don't belong to a church that has a lot of history of homosexuality, where Catholic priests, they just can't, because the hierarchy is so uh, seeped in this stuff.
Mhm.
So it's interesting that Orthodoxy is a relatively small religion, but there's a lot of priests that will like take this stuff on and wrestle with it and try to explain it. Where in Catholicism, it's very few.
Mhm.
You have somebody like James Martin who is very affirmative and he'll always talk about the subject. But otherwise, no, there's very little. So it's kind of funny. It seems like Orthodoxy is, I think, becoming a place where maybe people who are kind of confused or can't figure things out or are kind of wandering or searching, maybe it's a good place for them to kind of land or take a rest for a while. I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, our little mission has been growing. I'm hearing a lot of stories about people coming in who are, um, have great struggles, and they find the one thing that the church doesn't do is stigmatize you. In fact, it's kind of like the bigger your repentance, it's kind of like, wow, that's impressive. You've overcome a lot of stuff. People who have, one of the things that by seeing that people who struggle with this topic, they're bearing a cross, they're carrying a cross, and it's something that, when you see someone who's carrying it well and they're not stumbling and they're persevering on, it's like you could, the church gives us the ability to look at those people and say, wow, you're doing something amazing. That's when I hear about people who come out of that world, the gay world and everything else, and they're living their lives in the church, and they're struggling, but they're happy and they're fulfilled. That's like, I look at them and go, wow, I couldn't do what you're doing. You're a much you're a much better person in a lot of ways than I am, because it's like the bigger the cross that you carry, the greater, the greater the glory later. That's how we've seen it. When you see things going terribly for someone, you say, oh, God is working with this person. They've gotten this burden, but we believe when you are wounded, then God heals you, and the greater the healing, the greater the gift that you're getting from God.
But we need people like you, Father, because like when I was reading this article, I was like, oh, Father, he goes there. So we need people like you because you speak with the authority of church. So we need people like you to speak out, and I'm very thankful, Father.
No, well, thank God. It's unavoidable, and all of
Well,
us,
for some people, it is avoidable.
well, you'd be surprised. I mean, these phone things follow us everywhere, and they take us into terrible places.
No,
That's what's.
I meant for some people, it's avoidable to talk about or address. They just don't do it. But yeah, you
Oh, well,
certainly.
yeah. I mean, you can live you can live in Egypt all you want, but you still got a denial there. Um, that didn't come out the way I thought it was going to come out.
It was pretty good.
But yeah, I mean, denial isn't just rooted in Egypt. You can ignore it, but but that's the thing, is it doesn't ignore you.
Mm.
That's why I feel about politics. I'd love to ignore politics, but politics can't help but not ignore me. And as long as it keeps it being interested in me, I have to be interested in it. But I think this problem is so big and it's so prevalent that when the bubble bursts, there's going to be a lot of people raining down on us, and they're going to be asking for help. And whether we want to or not, we're going to be in a position to have to minister to them.
We're here. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's wonderful that there are guys that are out there like you who are carrying the torch and speaking the truth and keeping it out there. Because as much as you might get cussed out, I've seen some of this, some of your interactions with people and all that. And I would just say is, don't lose hope. Because it's for every person who reacts negatively, there's 10 other people standing in the back watching silently.
Yeah.
And that's what you go for, is the quiet ones in the back, because it's
Right.
yeah.
Father,
So
could you offer a blessing to me and anybody watching?
oh, God have mercy on us all. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Oh, Lord, help us overcome our passions and our sufferings, that we might better serve Thee, that we might better serve Thy servants who are in the midst of their suffering, and let our wounds that are healed by Thee become sources of healing for those who are now wounded. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Father, for your time.
Oh, it was a pleasure. We should do it again sometime.